Hello, and welcome to episode 123 of the Book Binge, my monthly reading wrap up in TBR, covering what I did in December and what I'm planning to do in January as we come into the new year. I gotta say, December was a month of mood reads and completions. For the most part, I didn't quite complete everything that I was hoping to, but also got done everything that I felt like I could. So there's kind of that back and forth, that dichotomy there. Some stuff was great, some stuff was very surprising to me. Let's talk about all of it here, starting just as usual with last month's reads. So first off, I suppose I ought to actually pull up the app to show you guys, because that would be a little bit useful. So first things first, I did complete, finally, Majority by Abby Goldsmith, the first book in Torth, and there we go, there's the cover. So I did do this, and I did pull up the audiobook, because although I was given an ARC for this, an e-ARC, to be able to read, I knew that I would not be able to make time for it over the end of the year, so I was able to finish this over the last few days of November and the first couple days of December, just before the last one of these reading wrap-ups and TBR videos came out. I had bought the audiobook so that I could finish it, and it turned out being a pretty good book. The story itself wasn't necessarily my favorite, but a lot of the underlying thematic material associated with it was enjoyable. So I recommend it for anybody who's interested in the themes. I will have a review for the book going up at some point. I don't know when off the top of my head, but if you only read books for the story and that's it, maybe you might be able to pass on this one, but maybe it'll work better for you than it did for me overall. I thought the first part was fantastic, so at least give that a shot, if nothing else. Next up, I did finish The Shadow Rising by Robert Jordan, fourth book in the Wheel of Time at last. Took me basically 2 full months to read it, and man, that was quite the journey. Also my least favorite in the series up to this point, which I know is an unpopular opinion, but that's genuinely how I felt about the book. If you want to know my specifics and you've read the book, there are 8 diaries for the video, but especially the last video, the last Wheel of Time diary, episode 21, is the one where I really go into most of my overall thoughts about the book at first, and it has an entire spoiler-free portion actually at the beginning, going over my thoughts on the entire book, so you can watch that even if you haven't fully read it. But that is available there. I did also finish Return to Dan. Again, this one took me a little bit longer than I wanted to get to, and then also a little bit longer to actively read, and I felt really bad about it for a couple reasons, not just because this copy was actually provided for me by Philip before the book actually officially released, and it still took me a couple months to make time for it, but also because every time I picked this book up and was reading it, but also because every time I was actually reading this book, every time I picked it up on one morning of the weekend or on Monday at work or something like that, it became obvious to me that I was like, I really just want to binge this book and read this until I'm done. But because of doing weekly reading diaries for, Wheel of Time, it kind of made it hard to actually do that for this. But when I did finally finish The Shadow Rising, I was able to plow through the back, basically half of this book in just a few days. And I'm so glad, because this was fantastic. I loved everything about this book. If you want to know more of my deeper thoughts about it, still in a spoiler-free context, I did write a review for it on Goodreads, nearly 2,000 words, which is probably more words than my reviews for the first 2 books combined, and even those were a little bit more in-depth than I normally do on Goodreads, so definitely check that out. I will have a review for this coming out near the end of the month. I believe, what day will it be? Let me just go ahead and check. It will be on the 23rd, I think. Yes, the 23rd will be the day that my review for this comes out, because on the 30th, I'll have a discussion with Philip himself about the entire trilogy going up on the channel as well. I haven't recorded that yet. I'll be doing that in a few days. I cannot describe to you how excited I am for that discussion because of how this book ended. Let's just say it had me teary-eyed for the last 50 to 60 pages of it, and it wrapped everything up more brilliantly and beautifully than I ever could have hoped it could. Now, for the biggest surprise of the month, I not only picked up No Country for Old Men by Cormac McCarthy, but I loved this book. I did only rate this 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads, but mostly out of stubborn principle, admittedly. This is also a book that I wrote a rather in-depth review for on Goodreads that I recommend checking out because it very well put my thoughts about the book together, and I was able to do it basically in the first draft. I had essentially no errors, even copy errors, in that review when I first wrote it, which is a rarity for whenever I just kind of spitball reviews, so that kind of shows how passionate I was for the book. I love this thing. After very much disliking The Road, I really enjoyed No Country for Old Men for a lot of reasons. That review kind of goes into it, but I will also be talking a little bit more about that in its own review at some point later this year, I believe over the next couple months. I'm not entirely sure again, but it will be happening, and I'm very excited to talk about this one a little bit more in depth. The next book that I actually read in December was another audiobook read, but this one was an audio only read. This was Alternate Routes, the first book in the Vickery and Castine trilogy by Tim Powers. Tim Powers comes highly recommended by Christopher Rocchio, my favorite author, and now a sort of close friend of mine. I would say we've started to develop a friendship over the last few months of working together on some things. But I will say this might not have been the best place to start with Tim Powers, because even though there was plenty of stuff about it that I really enjoyed or thought was really cool, it was also kind of weird in ways that I'm not entirely sure I was into. I will be continuing with the trilogy, and especially with Tim Powers in the future. I'll probably be doing more of that sooner than later, but we'll talk about that a little bit later in this video. But that book was decent. I will definitely be continuing the trilogy, like I said, to really kind of decide what I think about the books overall before I make any solid opinions about this one specifically. Next up, I did finish up my reread of Tales of the Sun Eater Volume 2, and I was able to do that all in one day. When I finally decided to just pick this up on a whim, was just like, I want to have this done before 2024. So I picked it up, and then I happened to get it done all in one day, and that was rather surprising to me. The cleanup, the copy edit cleanup for Tales 2 was one of the easiest and smoothest of all of my rereads so far, so that made it go by rather quickly, and I just enjoyed Tales Volume 2 a lot more this time around than I feel like I remembered liking it the first time, to the point that I actually rated this collection 5 stars on Goodreads when both Queen of Mid-Ashes and Tales Volume 2 separately, I have only 4 stars. Finally, one last thing to talk about is I did, again, kind of mood reading on a whim, decide to start Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy because there was a read-along scheduled for this month, and although I didn't finish it and I didn't even come halfway, I did manage to get through the first couple parts and start part 3, so I think it'll be kind of like a War and Peace situation for me with this, just being, behind everybody else with the read-along so everybody else can read what I thought at times, but, also just kind of taking it slow, going through a part of it here and there in between other reads, because that's what I'm doing. And this one is actually a fully dedicated immersive read, so that's allowing it to go by a little bit faster than it would be if it were just eyeballs as well, so there's always that helpful boon. But now that we've gone through all of that, that's one of my longer what did I read last month sections of the year, with October probably being the only one that was longer. What was my book of the month? Well, I'm going to give you 2 of them this month. It is kind of cheating, but I feel like it's justified in this instance. Reason number 1, because No Country for Old Men was so surprising to me that I want to give it this title. It was just so surprising to me, and I was so immersed in the world, and I loved Shigura as a villain so much, and there were some scenes that really got to me. Chapter 9 in particular was incredible. I just loved enough about this book that I feel justified in giving it at least an honorable mention for Book of the Month this month, because the fact that I picked it up at all was surprising, but the fact that I loved it so much was really what got to me. But if we're asking for the legit Book of the Month, well, it kind of has to go to Return to Adan, because I loved this thing. I loved everything about this thing, like I said before. Check out my written review of this and be prepared for my video review of this, because both of them will talk about all of the reasons why I just adored this book. As for this month's reads, well, there's a few things that I got planned. I realized that when planning it, even though I had thought I was, kind of being a little bit conservative with my reading plans, it turns out I was being a little bit over the top with my reading plans, because that's just how it always goes. So first off, I do plan to continue, maybe even finish on a Karenina. Not entirely sure if I will be able to have it done, but I would like to be a decent bit of the way through. But just as surprising to me as the fact that I read No Country for Old Men in December, I plan to read All the Pretty Horses in January. And not only do I plan to read it, I'm already part way through. And don't mind the second bookmark that's marking where part 3 happens, because I'm now on part 2. I'm already through part 1. And though it hasn't hooked me so far already as much as No Country for Old Men did, I have been enjoying it enough. It's more on the positive side. I am a little bit wary of how it's going to continue, and I'm anxious to see how the trilogy works for me overall over this first quarter of 2024, after I very disliked The Road but very loved No Country for Old Men. So this is kind of the next trial run in terms of McCarthy. The next couple things I can barely show. I suppose I could show a cover, but it would take me a little bit too long to find it. I will be doing the Disquiet Gods e-arc this month, when that releases, I believe, on the 16th of the month. And I'm going to be dropping literally everything else this month at that point so that I can read that book. I'm so unbelievably excited for it, you seriously have no idea, and every time I read something from Christopher related to it in some sense, such as I read the inside flap from the cover design, and it's the same description that's on Amazon, but I hadn't read it before, but that got me super excited. There's another couple things that he's talked with me about that has me super excited for Disquiet Gods, but yeah, it is probably my most anticipated read of the year, so I cannot wait to do that this month. Even though it's really long, and it's a book that, it's very similar in length to Demon in White, and Demon in White took me literally an entire month to get through. I wonder if I might be able to get through Disquiet Gods just in those last couple weeks of the month, just because I want to plow through it as quickly as possible, kind of experience it the way that I did with Ashes of Man, because that was so good, and I'm hoping that Disquiet Gods will be even better. As for the other thing that I would like to try to do, since it is an audio-only read, I would like to do Forest Perspectives, Book 2 in the Vicar and Castine trilogy, just to kind of see how that continues on and to see if it works any better for me distinctly. But otherwise, my main focus for January, and I say main focus even though it's definitely not my main focus, one of the things that I will be doing this month is starting a new series called Short Story Sundays. I've still got to figure out how exactly I'm going to do that, but the first short story that I'm going to do for that is Metzengerstein by Edgar Allan Poe, the first short story in this collection, and then the first short story in the collection for H.P. Lovecraft, that being The Beast in the Cave. So those are a couple short stories that I plan to read this month, and as opposed to last year where I said I wanted to read a lot of short stories, I ended up just reading all of the poetry by Poe, and that being it, and just kind of pushing the short stories off a little bit. Now, this year, I'm actually going to be reading short stories because I want to cover some of them on the channel on the Sundays opposite Fortnite on the Isle. As for the very pipe dream side of if I have time, I have a couple things that I would like to talk about here. Let me grab one of them because I forgot to. I would finally like to get back into reading Heroes of Olympus this year, so because the Disquiet Gods e-arc doesn't come out until the 16th, I think I'm almost certainly, I'm like 100% certain that I will finish All the Pretty Horses in the time, the first book of the Ordo trilogy in the time. Until then, I will be continuing to plug along at Anna Karenina, but those are really the only dedicated reads besides the short stories that I have planned for the month of actual eyeball reading. So because this book would be a really quick one, even knowing how fast I read The Lost Hero and The Son of Neptune, I think the speed at which I could read this means that I would be able to fit it in before Disquiet Gods comes out. So I do hope to be able to do that if the time kind of opens up for it. Otherwise, the other book on my schedule is East of Eden by John Steinbeck. I don't think I'm actually going to get to this one this month, because if I get to this one, I would like to read it all in one go, essentially, instead of breaking it up with another book. And especially since Disquiet Gods comes out halfway through the month, I don't want to drop whatever book I'm reading when I'm wanting to read it all in one go, just to go through Disquiet Gods basically all the way through in a couple weeks, a few weeks, however long it takes, and then return. So even though I did plan to read East of Eden in January, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to have it kind of like on the table in case I decide that I just really want to do it anyway. But otherwise, it looks like it's more going to be a February read, and this will probably be like my dedicated February read when it comes right down to it before I continue on with Wheel of Time in March. So that's kind of how things look for my TBR. Let me know what you're excited for me to read. Let me know what you thought about what I did read. I had a great month reading in December, even though I was rather lazy the last couple weeks of it. Just kind of doing nothing for the most part. I did really love what I was reading, and the first half of it was very busy with the reading, and I was very happy with what I did experience. You'll notice that there's a very evident lack of fantasy over the month, but that is pretty much what I'm doing this year. Is I want to do a lot more standalones. I want to do more palette cleansers. I want to do other books that I can just enjoy as they are, rather than committing myself to huge fantasy books every month. Because this year I definitely read a little bit too much of that, and especially too much all at once, because there were like 2 or 3 different points where I was reading like 3 epic fantasy books at the same time, and it's not very sustainable after a certain point. So I'm getting back to the literary fiction and the classics and stuff like that, and some of the other random stuff that maybe I wouldn't have otherwise read. But yeah, that is the plan for the month. Again, let me know what you thought of everything you saw in this video. But thank you guys for watching. Stick around for Thursday for my top 10 books of the year, including a few honorable mentions and a few dishonorable mentions. So if you want to see where, say, Return to Adan and maybe even No Country for Old Men might place on that list, if they do, maybe they're just honorable mentions, who knows? You can go ahead and check out that video on Thursday. Thank you again for watching. I'll be back in the next one.